Andy Thomas, New York Times Study Day.
Hi, London. Nice to see you.
Okay, so we're going to run for 29-30 minutes, and we'll tell you when the time's up.
Thanks for doing this.
Yeah, no problem.
I think there are two tasks that the Prime Minister has set for the London summit on the 2nd of April. The first is to take forward the key questions that were raised on the global financial system at the Washington summit in November. 47 tasks were set by the leaders of the G20 to make changes to the global financial system. But I think there's a second task, which is evident in the title of the summit, which goes beyond financial issues to look at jobs and growth. And that challenge is to bring leaders together to develop a response, a systemic response, adequate to the scale of the economic crisis that we face, not just the financial crisis. The economic crisis born on the one hand of the credit crunch, obviously, but also of the resource crunch that last year saw oil prices reach $147 a barrel. And that's why the agenda of the summit is about financial regulation, but it also extends to macroeconomic coordination, to key issues about international trade, to how we protect developing countries and a development agenda, and also how we plan for a sustainable recovery, especially a low-carbon recovery that doesn't repeat the mistakes that, in some ways, contributed to the resource crunch of last year. So there's a short-term agenda where confidence needs to be given to people around the world that some basic issues are being addressed, but there's also a longer-term agenda. And again, confidence is at the heart of it. Global leaders representing 75% of global GDP, showing that they are up to the challenge that's posed by this global economic crisis.
Kimiko Aoki from Japan Broadcasting Bureau Chief and Chief Correspondent. The G20 summit is different from G7, G8. In what way? And how would you show that you are including these countries, the G20 countries, in decision-making, especially if you were to take example the financial system, voting powers in the IMF, veto power of the America, these things, that would you be able to show concrete steps that not for just this occasion, but for the future?
I think this is a really important point because the phrase of the American Revolution, no taxation without representation, comes to mind. For some time, we've all known that economic power has shifted from west to east. But that shift of economic power hasn't been reflected in many of the multilateral institutions that were developed after the Second World War. And in the case of what is now the G8 in the 1970s. And that's why you've got the G8 plus 5. But the plus 5 feels like too much of an afterthought, not really an attempt to get to grips with where power lies in the world. I think the significant thing about the G20 is its inclusiveness. 75% of global GDP, China, India sitting at the table. And you're absolutely right that key issues of representation are raised by those countries, rightly in our view, about existing institutions. The Financial Stability Forum doesn't have a seat for China. The IMF has 3.5% of its voting weight for China. Those are issues those issues of representation, political representation, do need to be addressed, and I think that it's very much our intention that they're on the table for the summit.
Could I just add a question from one of our website viewers who says, this is Sally, who says, only a tenth of the world's countries are attending the summit. How come such a small proportion can take binding decisions for the world? Why don't you have some of the poorer countries there?
Well, I think it's a good point, and certainly one of our responsibilities is to reach out to all four corners of the world, north, east, south, and west, to reach out to ensure that a range of representation. I spoke to the South African Foreign Minister today and was speaking to her again later this week about the importance of representation for developing countries. But the truth about the modern interdependent economic world is that a crisis that is a crisis in the industrialized world and the financial system infects the economic possibilities of the developing world as well. And so this has to be an inclusive process, not just in its representation, but critically in its impact and effect. And I think that today you can honestly say that bringing stability to the financial markets of some of the most advanced countries is absolutely critical to prosperity for people, hundreds of millions of people living on less than $1 a day in the developing world. And that's why the agenda of the summit avowedly includes our commitments to the developing world.